You typically don't see first-party developers making games outside of their own consoles. For example, Nintendo never published games on the Sega Genesis. Why would they? They're the competitor. But in a shocking twist, Atari published many of their games on the competitors' consoles like the Intellivision and ColecoVision. Why would they do this, and was it effective? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. Anyway, let's talk about Atarisoft. The Atari 2600 was one of the first consoles to take cartridges. Instead of being stuck with built-in games, you could easily buy another cartridge and play a completely different game, despite it being on the same console. While the Atari 2600 was revolutionary for its time, the hardware was its weakest point. Games could only carry up to 4 kilobytes of ROM space without the use of bank switching. The console had a measly 128 bytes of memory. These limitations would become harder to work with when you consider how advanced games were becoming. Competitors stepped in and tried to capitalize on this. The first real threat to Atari was the Intellivision, released in 1979. Mattel was aiming for more realistic graphics and sound effects, which the 2600 didn't offer. The Intellivision had way more ROM at 1 kilobyte, and there were 16 kilobytes of ROM space built into the console itself. This gave developers more breathing room. Games carried anywhere from 4 kilobytes to 24 kilobytes of ROM space, which allowed for more content. With more RAM, built-in ROM space, and bigger cartridges, games could be much larger and contain more content. Some games featured multi-directional scrolling in multiple stages, which was unheard of on the 2600. Here's a question. If you're Atari, how do you deal with this type of situation? One way is by offering exclusive content on the 2600. If you want to play Pac-Man, Centipede, Missile Command, or Space Invaders, you can only do that on the 2600. By releasing these games elsewhere, you would be helping out the competition, right? Atari didn't think so. In 1983, Atari created Atarisoft, which would only be used to publish games on non-Atari consoles. The boxes to the games were color-coded depending on the console it was released on. The logo didn't use the typical Atari font, but instead a completely different font. Atari didn't actually develop any of the games in-house. Instead, they commissioned other companies to make them. You would be surprised at some of the games that Atari decided to bring over, like Pac-Man. It was a big deal that Atari secured the rights to it because it was one of the most popular games of all time. Having it only on the Atari 2600 was a major selling point, so I'm surprised they decided to release it on the Intellivision. This version is better too. The graphics look closer to the arcade version and there's no flickering. The Atari 2600 version barely resembled Pac-Man at all. The graphics hardly looked like Pac-Man, there was a lot of flickering, and the hit detection was off. The Intellivision game fixes all of these problems, although the level is not 100% accurate to the arcade version. I'm shocked that Atari released a better version of this game on a console that was not even theirs. Atari even brought over some of their own franchises like Centipede. It's a shooter where you must destroy every segment of the centipede to advance to the next stage. There's mushrooms scattered across the screen that helps the centipede reach the bottom faster. The spiders are probably the most annoying enemies because they occupy part of the screen and they're hard to shoot down. The graphics are slightly better than the Atari 2600 version, but the gameplay is not. The game seems to run at a slower frame rate, which is unlike the Atari 2600 version, which runs a lot smoother. Both versions are decent, but I prefer the 2600 game. Thankfully, Defender turned out well on the Intellivision. It's a horizontal shooter where you must destroy all the enemies to advance to the next stage. The enemies will try to abduct the astronauts at the bottom of the screen, and you must protect them. This version is mainly better because of the smoother scrolling. The 2600 version is decent considering the limitations, but the scrolling is very choppy. There really wasn't much they could do though because the console wasn't designed to scroll left or right. The Intellivision version is better for this reason alone. Another major competitor was the ColecoVision. Unlike the Intellivision, the ColecoVision's hardware obliterated the 2600. The console has 16 kilobytes of RAM and 8 kilobytes of built-in ROM space. As a reminder, the 2600 only has 128 bytes, not kilobytes of RAM, and no built-in ROM space whatsoever. Cartridges could carry up to 32 kilobytes instead of just 4 kilobytes like on Atari's console. The console was also designed to have more realistic graphics, and you could tell just by looking at the games. Donkey Kong had never looked better on a home console up until this point. If Atari wasn't in trouble already, Coleco came out with the expansion module which made the console compatible with 2600 games. With this new peripheral, there was almost no reason to buy Atari's console since they could already play the games anyway. Atari sued Coleco over it, but they would settle out of court. Coleco was allowed to continue selling the peripheral, but had to pay Atari royalties for it. Considering the fierce competition and legal battles that Atari went through, you would think they wouldn't try to help Coleco under any circumstances, but once again, Atari felt the need to publish games on the ColecoVision. Centipede turned out very well on this console. Unlike the Intellivision version, the gameplay is much smoother. Your character moves much more fluently, and it feels good in the hands. It's actually debatable whether this version or the 5200 one is better. The 5200 game does have more color and detail, but the ColecoVision version has much larger sprites and objects. It's a matter of preference, but I do enjoy the ColecoVision version more. The console received one of the best versions of Defender. Not only is the left and right movement very smooth, but there's even parallax scrolling. This is a very remarkable accomplishment considering that the ColecoVision is not even capable of scrolling. The ColecoVision also got a decent version of Galaxian. It's a shooter that's similar to Space Invaders. Rather than the enemies gradually moving closer and closer to the bottom, they each attack you individually. I'm actually impressed with how close this version looks to the Famicom one. It even has the stars moving in the background. The Atari 2600 version is okay, but it did receive a graphical downgrade and there's no stars in the background. Once again, it's debatable whether you prefer this one or the 5200 version. The 5200 game doesn't look quite as good graphically, and the enemies move more robotically, but the gameplay is slightly more arcade accurate. The enemies will sometimes stop in place to avoid your attacks, just like in the arcade original, but in the ColecoVision version, they don't do this. Despite this one nitpick though, I do think the ColecoVision version is better. Pac-Man was going to be ported over to the ColecoVision, and there is a prototype version of the game, but it was never released. Had it been released, it would have been a good version of the game. The graphics look similar to the 5200 game, and neither version is better or worse than the other. Unlike the Intellivision one, the whole level is here too. It's unclear why it wasn't released, but maybe Atari realized they shouldn't be giving the competitor one of the most popular games. Atari didn't only publish games for competitors' consoles, but they even made some for computers as well. Atari did make their own line of home computers in 1979 called the Atari 400 and 800. The hardware was more powerful than anything that was out at the time. You were basically getting 5200 hardware as early as 1979, think about that. Despite having their own home computer, that didn't stop Atari from publishing computer games elsewhere. Commodore 64 owners were very fortunate to receive several Atari games, including some Namco ones. They got one of the best versions of Donkey Kong. Unfortunately, Nintendo's classic arcade game didn't have the best run on home consoles. The Atari 2600 version only had 2 levels and all the cutscenes were removed. The ColecoVision version was better, but was still missing the Cement Factory level and all the cutscenes. Nintendo's own Famicom version was the closest thing we would get to the arcade original, but it's still missing the Cement Factory and all the cutscenes. The Commodore 64 would get one of the best versions of the game. The opening cutscene is still present where Donkey Kong takes Pauline to the top of the screen. Graphically, the game looks way better than most other versions, and even the Cement Factory level remains. This is a huge accomplishment considering that not even Nintendo's own version got it. It's insane that Atari gifted Commodore 64 owners the best version of Donkey Kong for no apparent reason. Atari ported over some of their own franchises as well, including Battlezone. It's a combat game where you drive in a 3D environment and destroy as many enemies as possible. I was impressed with the 2600 version and how they turned a vector game into a raster one, but the Commodore 64 version looks like true vector-style graphics. This was by far the best version of the game at the time. A few of Namco's titles made it on here. In Dig Dug, you must destroy all the enemies by inflating them. This version looks nice graphically, but I have one complaint. In the arcade version, the enemies will run away when you try to drop a boulder on them, but in this version, the enemies continue chasing you, so you're easily able to crush them. It's a minor nitpick though, and it's still a decent version of the game. Pole Position is on here too, and it's a decent version. When comparing it to the 5200 game, it looks nearly identical. I don't consider one to be better than the other. I did notice that the Commodore 64 version is a bit easier though. Even though I crashed numerous times in a single lap, I was still able to finish without running out of time. We talked a lot about Pac-Man, but not so much Ms. Pac-Man. Atari did publish a few versions of the game on their own consoles, but they never brought it over to the ColecoVision or Intellivision. That's a different story with the Commodore 64 though. This version doesn't play quite as smoothly as the 7800 game, but it does look and play better than the others. Sometimes it's debatable which version is better. In Moon Patrol, you play as a vehicle who must reach the destination without taking damage. You can shoot in 2 different directions, and you can jump to avoid craters. If you get hit by an enemy or fall into a crater, you lose a life. The game was released on the 5200 as well, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages. The graphics are a bit better on the Commodore 64 version, but the controls are worse. In the 5200 game, you can control your direction while in the air, but in the Commodore 64 version, you can only jump straight up and you're unable to control your movement mid-air. The craters also have a weird hitbox in the Commodore 64 version. Even if you're nowhere near it, you still die. The graphics might be better, but I prefer the 5200 version because of the better controls. Defender is another game that's debatably inferior. Don't get me wrong, this is a very nice version of the game, but it's hard to compete against the ColecoVision one because of the parallax scrolling background. But honestly, that's just a graphical difference, and you really can't go wrong with either one. I just wanted to go over a few of the games that Atari published on other consoles. It's surprising what games they chose to bring over. You would think they wouldn't port over high-profile games like Pac-Man, but they absolutely did. The quality of the games are surprisingly decent too. I figured they wouldn't put as much effort because they're not on Atari consoles, but that wasn't the case. It could be because Atari didn't develop them directly. In contrast, Coleco did publish games for the Atari 2600, but those versions were significantly worse than the ones made for their own console. Some people speculated that they were butchered on purpose to make the ColecoVision look better. If this is true, it makes you wonder why Atari didn't do the same thing. So why did Atari choose to publish games for the competitors' consoles? What's in it for them? There's one simple reason. Atari was making a lot of money by doing this. If someone buys the Intellivision version of Pac-Man, Atari is still going to make money off of it, even if it's not their own console. I still think it might have been a risky move though. Remember that Space Invaders was a big reason why the Atari 2600 became a success. Arcade ports were a huge selling point for the console, and to see Atari give some of them away to the competition is surprising. The Atarisoft brand would not last for long. In 1984, the original Atari Incorporated under Ray Kassar would start to see financial issues and would be split into 2 companies. Atari Corporation, which had all the Atari assets, only used the label a few times before discontinuing it in 1985. The brand only lasted roughly about 2 years. If you made it this far in the video, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right there. And how do you feel about Atari making games on competitors' consoles? Why do you think they did it, and was it a good idea? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.